So probably we had the conversation if we are rock stars or other things. I would say, no, we are special agents because we are from procurement, we are from startup, we are from venture capital and all relevant business functions. And we have the license to innovate, to grow, to drive the top line. We have the license to fight inflation, to reduce costs, and we have the license to decarbonize our supply chains to make them more sustainable and to de-risk it. And now I can just sit back and relax because the other people here I put here are in charge now to entertain you. No, of course, I'm kidding. And I've brought some excellent experts together with me really to focus on different aspects in different industries. So what is relevant maybe in the food industry might be a completely different story in the banking industry or in the software industry. So give this audience a big hand. And, oh, come on, I have already, let's say, spilled my water on this. So, first of all, I would love to introduce Janelle, CPO from Kraft Heinz, Edzard, CPO from RBI, which is an Austrian bank, and last but not least, we have Jared Ezzell, the CCO from Certa, and probably they will give you more insight what disruption, what geopolitical changes mean, and how their companies are adapting to it. And I hope I have their agreement, and I'm pretty sure I have their agreement. Questions are allowed. Huh? So probably if you have some burning questions, feel free to raise your hand, and then probably we could incorporate them at the very end. So thank you very much. And I would love to hand over now, ladies first, to Janelle. So please, maybe you can say 2 or 3 words to your position, and then I remember we had a little chit-chat on climate change, on, let's say, labor shortages, and maybe on safety issues, and how does this affect Kraft Heinz? So let's catch it up.
Yeah, no, thank you, Karsten. Nice to see everyone. So Janelle Orozco, CPO at Kraft Heinz, but spent kind of my whole career in procurement. Was actually the company called Diageo for about 21 years before joining Kraft Heinz back in January. So kind of always been in the food and beverage space. So I know we'll get into it, but one of the biggest kind of things we're thinking about, obviously spending a career in procurement, always known that procurement's as much creating value for the business as it is managing risks associated with third parties. And just want to get into kind of some of the risks that are happening now versus maybe what they were before, particularly around regulation in the food space and ESG regulations in particular, and how that impacts consumer product goods.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. And you have, let's say, touched on some things. Let's say labor shortages are heavily affecting you. So how does it really translate into the business, and what do you do about it?
Yeah, so we were talking about, I think in North America specifically, although I feel like it's kind of a global situation really with kind of post-COVID and lots of changes in like the labor markets. We're actually facing a pretty significant labor shortage in North America, and the way there's kind of been a bit of this perfect storm. So some of the risks that have come up recently is around actually child labor in the supply chain, which has always been a risk in particular industries more so than others, but actually wasn't something you really thought about from a North America context very seriously. So again, Past Life was working very globally, and we had human rights audits that we did across our supply chain, but again, mostly focused in countries outside of North America. But it's actually something that's popped up quite significantly in the US. And so we're thinking about how to think about where those risks might be, how to use data, how to use technology to help us more predict or kind of proactively go after managing those risks. But yeah, we've seen instances in this past year of child labor in our supply chain connected to just this kind of perfect storm of a shortage of labor, kind of looser regulations in the US than what we have seen in the past, and therefore companies finding ways to kind of skirt processes and having kids working in very risky environments. And so it's, again, something that just remember to keep it top of mind.
Yeah. And what do you actually do about it? So you're doing a kind of a mass mailing, please, suppliers, just confirm that everything is safe, and they say, yes, everything is safe, or probably I hope you get one step further.
No, like anything, I think it's a risk-based approach, right? We have to look at where we think the biggest risks are and then take approach to do regular audits to have the right conversations. And when it has popped up, which again it has this year, really spending time at a very senior level between our company and their company to get comfortable with the actions that they're taking. Because if we're not comfortable, then we have to take a decision to exit or find other suppliers. But just, I think, again, using a risk-based approach is kind of how we do this with anything, and finding the ways to figure out where we think the highest risk is and then go after having formal audits.
Excellent. So just moving across the table, now we're coming from the food industry to the banking industry and or financial service industry. And if we are, let's say, moving ourselves back something like 1.5 years back, so we have all seen that Russia declared war on Ukraine, and there have been this attack within Europe, and I and most other people would not have ever imagined that we still have a war on the European base, but things happen, and as a quite quick reaction on this, the European Union imposed some sanctions on Russia, and as far as I know, Russia was even withdrawn from the official banking and money exchange systems, and just putting this news in the headlines that we just see on TV into the reality of a CPO of a global operating bank, Edzard. So maybe you could put this into the context. So, or maybe first briefly give 2 or 3 words more in the introduction, because you're the CPO of an entire group. But really, what does it, let's say, mean for you and your position?
Yeah. I'm responsible for procurement and outsourcing at Raiffeisen Bank International. We are a banking group in Central Eastern Europe, around about 45,000 employees. And we have also significant banks in Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. And 24th of February 2022 was a very special date. You can imagine being present in all 3 countries. That gives you a lot of considerations. But what was interesting was the first weeks after, when the countries imposed first sanctions, the EU, the US, UK, Canada, the way how suppliers from these countries reacted. Everybody had a different interpretation on some things. Chaos when boards took decisions, we are moving out of Russia, or we are stopping business in Russia. What does it really mean? Do we stop selling? Do we stop support and maintenance? So it took a lot of iterations to understand really what is a standpoint of each supplier. And there was not a general tendency, so everybody took different positions on that, although the sanctions were pretty much covering all industries. So that was quite a challenge to find out what is really happening on the external supplier side vis-a-vis Russia. What is also important is that you understand not only what does it mean for your external suppliers, but you also have to understand what it means for your internal supply chains. Because everybody in a group like that, everybody has shared service centers, everybody has head office provisioning business services to entities, and so you have most of the times you're more linked with each other than you would assume. Luckily enough, in my organization, I'm also responsible for internal contracting, so we have a good visibility of how we can connect internal contracts to external contracts. And that is, I think, a capability you need to have when you are in a situation like that. You have to understand not only what do sanctions mean on the supplier side, but also what do sanctions mean on your internal supply and demand relationships. And that, I think, helped us a lot getting through this. Not to say biggest respect, and I would love, I don't know if Alexandra is here, she's our procurement leader in Ukraine. She is on this conference. I mean, those colleagues were basically working from bomb shelters and under war conditions, so that had absolutely special respect, incredible what my colleagues did there. Yeah.
Yeah, probably, and this is true for many companies who have, or let's say many companies have outsourced their IT department to Ukraine, so there is lots of, let's say, good and highly educated people there, and the first thing is really to safeguard your people or to get your business out of, or really to protect your people, and then how to make your business running in these, well, extremely volatile days. That's absolutely key. So, Jared from Certa. So, what do your customers say, and how can you and Certa help your customers, let's say, try to navigate through these risky times? So you say there is a multitude of different compliance, legal issues, geopolitical issues. So what are the things that keep you or your customers awake at night?
Yeah, so introduction of Certa, we're an operating system for the risk-appropriate management of third parties across the life cycle, right? Not all risks are created equal. There's multiple domains of risk, depending on your vertical and industry, how do you operate. And so a lot of our clients, from a trend perspective, forced labor, right? Yeah. So if you're in the US and you're an importer, things like UFLPA are now instituted, and that creates both an opportunity and a challenge for clients. Even outside the US, there's multiple regulations now, thankfully popping up, requiring companies to understand not only their tier one risk of forced labor, but also sub-tier, all the way down to factory, farm, local province. And so, at the end of the day, we get heavily involved in conversations around the marriage of data, which 10 years ago, was a much different conversation than now. Right now, it's the mass of data is the problem. Back then, it was there's so limited information that's digitized. How do we find this intelligence? Now it's about how do we efficiently understand these risks, parse out the mountain of data assets that are out there for the needle in the haystack, as they say, for risk domain X versus Y, whether it's sanctions or forced labor or financial or operational, you name it. And so that's been a lot of what our clients have struggled with is how to effectively pull in risk intelligence, but then wrap their policy procedures and risk tolerance around that data intelligence and then effectively, efficiently execute, right? Data and intel without execution is pointless. And so, again, today's technology, that is all doable. Automation against risk intelligence is definitely doable nowadays. Obviously, AI is now in the mix to help in that regard as well. So it's fun times at the same time as challenging times.
Yeah. And how do you ensure this, let's say, one single source of truth, or really to avoid data redundancies or let's say not existing data, because we know all the old saying garbage in, garbage out, and we have most of the, let's say, siloed legal, financial, operational, quality, whatever systems, and really extracting data using AI is seems to be easy, but if you're really down to the ground, I think then this is really where the work begins.
Yeah. I mean, single pane of glass, right? Point solutions that silo data are not helpful to the cause, right? So what we very often do day one is integrate into client A's tech stack, which is always different than client B, than client C, integrate with their chosen data partners, and just create this connective tissue of visibility across all of those point solutions and data sets that can then be configured and tuned to help solve sanctions compliance, forced labor compliance, anti-bribery, anti-corruption, KYC on the customer side of the coin.
Yeah, I see. And probably then you have got one big data lake where you can extract different sets of data depending on your customer requirements, whether it's finance, whether it's ESG, whether it's customer perspective, whatever.
Exactly.
Okay.
And via those integrations, you keep it fresh and maintained and updated. and evolving regulations, as we were talking about prior to this, right? So what happens, what makes sense day one is always fluid and organic and changing. As we all know in the room, the bar of reasonability from a regulatory perspective continues to rise. And so that's a forced maturation that clients need to respond to.
Yeah.
It's probably relevant to talk, we were mentioning earlier, like there's one thing about having great data, and that's clearly a starting point to have the ability to assess where you think those risks are. But I think actually it's the human intelligence of being able to take the insights from that data and then have the conversations, right? Because the tool that you're talking about is fantastic as a starting point, but the actual solve comes from having the conversations, understanding what the risks are, finding the ways to mitigate it, which might mean finding a new supplier. It might mean working differently with the existing supplier. And I think the role of procurement, and I think the procurement individual has changed a lot in needing to be able to think really differently about risk and anticipate risk, and then think really creatively about solutions to how do you go about solving for some of those challenges.
Yeah. And what about maybe the gap between the legal challenge and really what your maybe tier 1, 2, 3, 4 suppliers can really provide? So especially looking at maybe, let's say I'm a small farmer, I don't know, in Mexico or in the US, raising tomato for your company, and I don't have even a clue. I know maybe there is a drought, maybe it's quite quite hot, and maybe the season is good or not. This is maybe what I know, but really, how can I? If you ask me about labor, child labor, if you talk me about CO2 emission footprints, so where do I get all this information from? Is there any, let's say, help or any support from Kraft Heinz to their supply, and how do you really go down deep in the supply chain? Because as you mentioned, most of the problems are not in your direct tier 1 suppliers, but in your sub suppliers down the road.
Yeah, I mean, I think the starting point is obviously looking at your supplier selection process and looking at the kinds of suppliers that you want to work with. And then, trying to work, you can't do it for everybody, right? As a company like Kraft Heinz, 30,000 plus suppliers, you're not going to do that for every single person. But I think what we're looking at, and I think a lot of other companies are looking at, is tools to help, particularly with things like CO2 emissions and the ESG changes that are happening, to try to not put such a burden on suppliers. To your point, maybe you are a small supplier and you don't want to have to give the same information in 16 different ways to the companies that you're working with. So how do we try and drive standardization and, again, use technology as a way to make that process a lot more seamless and a lot more collaborative with our suppliers?
And you mentioned you got something like 30,000 suppliers or plus. So how do you measure the criticality of a supplier? Because you can focus on your top suppliers in terms of, volumes or business, but sometimes it's maybe more the smaller ones which are causing the problems.
Well, it depends, I guess, on the context of what you're talking about, right? If you're the domain of, you have certain suppliers that are going to be riskier from a financial perspective, you're going to have some suppliers that are riskier depending on their location when sanctions come up, or you're going to have some suppliers that you have a higher risk because they have more labor in their supply chain, like we talked about earlier. Then you think about the other risks that are kind of, external risks, whether that's climate change or things like that. So there's just more and more risks. I feel like I was reflecting on 20 years ago when I started in procurement. I feel like the risks were maybe the volumes of your product went faster than you expected, and you had to get more volume into the supply chain from a supplier, or you had the odd bankruptcy now and again that you had to manage through. But the level of risk that happens now is a regular conversation that we're having. And again, I just think the talent and the ability to think differently is really critical.
Yeah. And Edzard, when we had our initial conversations, you said, well, there are so many, let's say, legal or compliance issues in Germany, in the European Union, in the US. And if you want to do this, let's say, step by step, checking your contracts and one after the other against this sanction or this regulation, this will just slow you down too much. So how do you cope with this, to do this really at scale or at speed?
Yeah, I think what changed tremendously in the last 3 to 5 years is the amount of regulations and laws you're exposed to. And frankly, I don't see an end to it. Yeah, we have the upcoming Digital Operational Resilience Act, which is first time not only affecting the financial industry, but also suppliers to the financial industry. So it is a reality, you have to cope with it, and it has a couple of implications. Number one, For example, volume does not matter when it comes to compliance. Yeah. A SaaS solution which is maybe costing you 50,000 euro has a full stack of outsourcing relevance, criticality assessment, exit plans, annual reviews. So the overhead on such a solution may be bigger than the actual cost of the solution. The second thing is respecting all the various regulations means that you have to change your processes. Yeah, you can't work sequentially. Otherwise, it would slow you down, and the Sourcing Act, which is fully exposed to all regulations, would take months or if not years. Yeah? So you have to work in parallel. You have to create teams, and you have to create some smart solutions as well, like one-stop shops where everybody works in and doing that. Next thing, it's not only the contracting, it is also the reporting and the contract management. So, for example, there's the outsourcing regulation in the from the European Central Bank, which requires you once per year to deliver an outsourcing register. The one we delivered in April had about well beyond 30,000 data fields. Yeah? This you can't manage across a group anymore with Excel or email or whatever. So you need to have systems in place, and where you can basically take real time the data, and you are able to report and also check your own compliance. And since we're talking 2023, I mean that's reality now. But I think the future is already that you have in contract drafting already regulatory compliance checked, with intelligent contract management systems.
So there is an AI checking, I don't know, your proposal against the regulation, and I don't know, highlights, what are the things you have to look at?
That we will see in the next 12 to 24 months.
Okay.
The next thing is, nowadays I think everybody who uses contract management systems, you go a lot via metadata. Yeah, but I think the future is more that you check your contracts, not only filling the data fields with auto extraction, I think that's already possible today, but it's checking each and every contract on legal and regulatory compliance against the regulations. So you would not tick the box in your metadata fields, but you would have a real-time check already while contract drafting and also for legacy contracts against the regulations. I think we will see that in the next 12 to 24 months. I can only say it is not possible to manage that anymore manually. Yeah, that is absolutely impossible.
What about the receiving party? Let's say all the agencies, all the regulators. So if I'm just looking at German government bodies, they are still using faxes. They are still pretty much paper-based. Are they already? And for example, I'm pretty sure that the Dutch people are much more digital, or in Estonia or in other countries. But what about this one? Are they still the cavemen in their, let's say, waiting for the tiger and receiving some Excel sheets?
I think at least the regulators are beefing up their digital capabilities, because
you're very polite.
They have to deal with the enormous amount of data from all the European system relevant banks to come to conclusions where to steer and where to manage. And what goes for, I would say, the subjects of the regulation will also be valid for the regulators. I mean, if I have an audit from EZB or national regulators, I give them access to our contract management system, so I don't produce paper anymore. They can have real-time access to and look at the contracts themselves. And I think that gives a level of transparency, what helps both sides.
Jared, we had a conversation on not slowing down the business. So maybe you can expand a little bit on this, because let's say the business is not just there to fulfill some regulatory stuff or to report, but let's say we have to drive markets, customers, innovation. So how do you help your customers with balancing the priorities?
Yeah, I mean, as mentioned, you can throw a bunch of bodies at the problem statement, that it's evolving over time, or you can leverage what's available in technology in 2023 to try to, again, automate the consumption of data, automate the recognition of certain risk signals and risk flags, automate the review of that data, and when your risk policy and risk tolerance says 10 out of 10 times, I'm going to say no, or I'm going to say yes, no point in having eyeballs on that. We have some clients, Fortune 10, highly regulated, that are automating 80% of their onboarding risk vetting activities, covering off a long list of regulatory use cases. Yeah. Some of what we've talked about and others unique to their vertical and the industry they're in. So the potential of leveraging tech to drive efficiency, even with the increased regulatory burden world that we are now in, is absolutely doable today. And again, not the same conversation 5 years ago or even 10 years ago to the point that we're at.
Yeah, and probably we cannot run our business on Excel sheets and even with AI we cannot foresee any black swans, so we can foresee what we can foresee, but the rest is probably there are little risks that might be still out of scope. So I'm just looking at the time, so we have got something like 4 minutes. So I raised all my silly questions, but I'm sure you have got much better ones. So Matt, please shoot on.
Hello, Matt Langley from CBRE. Having been in procurement for 25 years, our main solution for most problems seems to be we run an RFP. And we've tweaked the RFP to include risk and sustainability and diversity and everything. Is the RFP dead now? Because we spend so much time and effort to work with our current suppliers to get them up to the levels we want. So the change to a new supplier is a lot higher than it used to be. It's not just about cost anymore. Or if the RFP is not dead, do we then have higher requirements for the suppliers to come in as we do the market analysis?
I mean, I would say, I don't think the RFP is dead. I think that, right, it has its place. It depends on the situation. But I think the kind of need to have people go out and find new sources of supply, because like now with the regulations, not everybody can meet that, right? The maturity curves across the 30,000 suppliers, let's say, is vast. You will have suppliers, I mean, your example of faxing, right? Like maybe that's the extreme, but you're going to have suppliers that are fully digitized, that understand all of this, and you're going to have suppliers that are still on paper and Excel. So I think I would say the role of the procurement person is quite different than it used to be, and you described a little bit of that in how you think about working with suppliers where that makes sense to bring them up to the standards, or if they're at the standard to maybe get even more innovation or more savings or whatever it might be out of them. But I think actually the good old-fashioned like going and finding new sources of supply that are maybe more creative or more tuned in to these kinds of matters than your existing suppliers is still a really important role that we have to play. And then integrating those suppliers into the business, again, is usually not easy because there's always resistance to change. And so I think, again, that's the role of where we have to keep influencing the organization and staying on top of some of these challenges.
I would see it the same way. But there are also specifics to the industry, and if you have suppliers who are embedded in your industry, then they know basically what is required. It's more difficult with suppliers which are coming outside from like software is generic here. Those companies are sometimes struggling. On the other hand, I mean, IT risk is relevant for a production company, and it's relevant for a bank. I mean, if it's a generic thing. So if you fulfill the requirements of a bank on IT risk and cybersecurity, that is, for me, the gold standard also for other industries. Yeah? So it's a question how you look at regulations. Either you try to dodge and evade them, for me, the wrong strategy. You have to embrace them on the procurement side, and you have to embrace them on the supplier side and make the best out of it. Yeah? Again, IT risk is, for me, a very good example because it's really generic. Yeah? And I think that if you're in the software industry, if you do not comply with high coding standards, with high architecture standards, then yes, you have a problem to supply, yeah, to big corporations. Yeah.
And maybe it might be a difference whether you're in the private industry or maybe in the public sector in terms of RFPs and things like this, because I think this might be talking to governments or public sector. You say you have a creative idea, but I'm pretty sure they will still run you the same old process.
I mean, I think it was surprising, but it's not unheard of, right? Like modern slavery, there is, forced labor across the world, not in developed countries as much as undeveloped countries. But I would say that it's a framework, right? So you have to put a framework together that identifies the different elements of risk, that identifies your risk tolerance, to kind of Jared's point earlier. But something like that, obviously, you would have zero tolerance for. And then you have to approach it to say, you're never going to find everything. It's never going to be perfect. You're always going to have to also adapt to the situations that you face. So I think it's about being able to do as much as you can due diligence to make sure that you've thought about the risks and you've assessed them in your supply chain and the different elements of risk. But then when they happen, because inevitably something's going to happen, something is going to pop up, something's going to change, then how do you address it? How do you take the right proactive approach to go and have the right conversations and then take the right decisions for the business?
Excellent. So I already got the red card blinking here. Say, Karsten, you have to stop now. Time is over. So sorry for, let's say, running a little bit out of time. But I think it was a very interesting conversation. And my last recommendation, use your chance to really talk to these people. They are here. If you talk to them 1 week later, they might be busy. I don't have time to answer your phone call, your email, whatever. So grab the time, use the opportunity to network, to get really direct conversation with these experts. And for me, it was fun having you here. Have a great conference. Thank you very much.